Picture this. You're trapped under tons of snow, your lungs burning as you claw desperately upward through the suffocating white darkness. Above you, maybe 10 feet, maybe 50, your fellow trappers are digging frantically, their shouts muffled to whispers by the crushing weight of the avalanche. This is exactly where Jerry Coulter found himself on a bitter February morning in 1815, buried alive with 12 other men in what would become known as the Teton disaster. Only Jerry would crawl out breathing. The other 12 would remain forever entombed in that mountain grave, their frozen bodies a grim reminder that the peaks of the American West didn't care about human ambition or the fortunes waiting to be made in beaver pelts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That avalanche should have killed Jerry Coulter. By all rights, his story should have ended there in the crushing white silence beneath Devil's Thumb Ridge. Instead, it became his beginning. What emerged from that snow wasn't the same man who'd gone in. The Jerry Coulter who clawed his way to the surface, gasping and wild-eyed, had been fundamentally changed by those terrifying minutes of burial. He'd felt the mountain's raw power, experienced firsthand how quickly tons of snow could turn a profitable morning into a mass grave. Most men would have packed up and headed for safer country. Jerry did the opposite. He became obsessed. For the next 17 years, Jerry Coulter would dedicate his life to understanding the White Death that had nearly claimed him. He studied avalanches, the way a scholar studies ancient texts, with a mixture of reverence and desperate need to comprehend. He learned to read the mountains like a book written in snow and stone, wind and temperature. And in the winter of 1832, that knowledge would save 40 men from sharing the fate of his buried companions. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to Jerry in those early years after his survival, when he was still just another mountain man trying to make sense of what had happened to him. The fur trade in the 1820s was America's version of a gold rush, except instead of nuggets, men were after beaver pelts. The fashion-conscious gentlemen of London and New York couldn't get enough of those lustrous beaver hats, and they were willing to pay handsomely for them. This demand created an entire economy in the wilderness, where a good trapper could make more in a season than a farmer might see in 5 years. But the profits came with a price, and that price was often paid in blood and frozen corpses. Jerry had come west like thousands of others, drawn by stories of easy money and adventure. He was competent enough with a trapline, adequate with a rifle, and possessed the kind of stubborn endurance that kept a man alive in country that actively tried to kill him. Before the avalanche, he was unremarkable. After it, he became something else entirely. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In the months following his survival, Jerry found himself unable to focus on trapping. Every shift in the wind, every change in snow conditions, every distant rumble in the peaks would send him into a state of heightened alert. His fellow trappers initially thought it was what we might today recognize as trauma. They weren't entirely wrong, but they missed the crucial element. Jerry wasn't just reliving his terror, he was learning from it. He began seeking out the Shoshone and Crow bands that wintered in the lower valleys. These tribes had been reading avalanche signs for generations, passing down knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in the high country. The native peoples had names for different types of snow, classifications for wind patterns, and an almost mystical understanding of how the mountains behaved in winter. Jerry absorbed this wisdom like a man dying of thirst drinks water. But Jerry didn't stop with traditional knowledge. His trapper's mind, accustomed to solving practical problems, began developing innovations. He started experimenting with what other mountain men mockingly called his contraptions, empty bottles hung from ropes, creating an early warning system that would sing in certain wind conditions. Tin pots strategically placed to catch and amplify the subtle sounds that preceded avalanches, carved wooden markers that indicated safe routes and danger zones, a primitive but effective mapping system. To understand how radical this was, imagine being the only person in your group who insisted on wearing a seatbelt before anyone else thought cars were dangerous. Jerry's fellow trappers saw his precautions as the paranoid ramblings of a man who'd never fully recovered from his buried experience. They had bigger concerns than Jerry's strange noisemakers. They were focused on the serious business of getting rich. The economics of the fur trade created a culture of calculated risk. Every day spent being overly cautious, was a day of potential profits lost to competitors. The mountains were crawling with rival trapping parties, all racing to strip the streams clean of beaver before anyone else could get there. In this environment, Jerry's insistence on elaborate safety measures marked him as either a coward or a madman. But here's what his critics didn't understand. Jerry wasn't just protecting himself anymore. The avalanche had given him something beyond fear. It had given him responsibility. He'd been the sole survivor of a disaster that killed 12 men, 12 fathers, sons, brothers who would never return home because the mountain had spoken and no one had known how to listen. Jerry had appointed himself the mountain's translator. By 1831, Jerry's reputation had reached a strange equilibrium. Trapping parties would hire him as a guide because his knowledge of safe routes was undeniably valuable. But they'd also mock his increasingly elaborate warning systems and his habit of consulting what appeared to be random collections of bottles and pots before declaring a valley safe or dangerous. They wanted his expertise without his eccentricity, his knowledge without his warnings. That winter, as 1831 turned to 1832, Jerry's devices began telling him something that filled him with dread. The snow was wrong. The wind patterns were wrong. Everything about the mountain's behavior suggested that the peaks were building towards something catastrophic, and this time there were more men in the high country than ever before. The stakes weren't 12 lives anymore. They were 40. Would you like me to continue to the next chapter? The first sound came at dawn on February 10th, 1832, a low, haunting moan that drifted across Bear Creek Valley like the voice of something ancient and angry. Jerry Coulter bolted upright in his bedroll, instantly alert. That sound meant his bottle and rope contraption near Widow's Peak was responding to wind patterns he'd learned to fear. The mountain was speaking, and it was saying, "Run." But Jerry wasn't the only one who heard it. Across the valley, 43 trappers from 7 different parties were going about their morning routines, brewing coffee and checking trap lines. They heard the eerie wailing too, but to them it was just another of Coulter's strange contraptions making noise. Some laughed. Others cursed the madmen who'd turned their peaceful wilderness into a carnival of clanking metal and moaning bottles. They had no idea they were listening to their salvation. By noon, Jerry's entire network was alive with sound. The carefully positioned tin pots were creating rhythmic pinging as wind-driven snow crystals struck them in patterns Jerry had learned to interpret. Higher up the valley, his carved wooden markers were collecting snow in ways that told him wind direction, temperature, and the dangerous density of accumulating powder. Each element of his system was designed to detect the subtle environmental changes that preceded catastrophic avalanches. To understand what Jerry was hearing, imagine an orchestra tuning up before a performance. To untrained ears, it's just noise. But to someone who understands the instruments, each sound carries meaning. Jerry had spent 17 years learning to conduct this orchestra of early warning, and now every instrument was screaming the same message. The mountain was about to unleash hell. Pierre Dubois, the leader of the largest French-Canadian trapping party, was the first man Jerry approached with his warnings. Dubois was a practical man who respected Jerry's knowledge of safe routes, but he had 22 men and 3 seasons' worth of investment riding on this winter's catch. When Jerry burst into his camp, babbling about singing bottles and wooden profits, Dubois listened politely and then dismissed him. "Mon ami," Dubois said, stirring his morning coffee. "Your bottles, they make noise in every storm. Why is this one different?" Jerry tried to explain the subtle variations in pitch and rhythm that indicated unprecedented danger. But how do you describe a language that exists only in wind and snow to someone who's never learned to speak it? Frustrated, Jerry pulled out his hand-drawn maps, crude charts that marked danger zones and safe camps. He pointed to Bear Creek Valley, where Dubois had established his main camp. "This whole drainage is a death trap when the conditions align like this," Jerry insisted. "The snow's been building for weeks in the hanging valleys above you. One temperature change, one wind shift, and it all comes down at once." Dubois glanced at his men, who were watching the exchange with barely concealed amusement. These were hard men who'd survived grisly attacks and Blackfoot raids. They weren't about to abandon a profitable location because bottles were making noise. "We stay," Dubois announced firmly. "But merci for the warning." Jerry's next stop was the American camp led by Marcus Thompson, a Tennessee mountain man who'd brought 15 trappers north for the season. Thompson knew Jerry's reputation and was more willing to listen, but his response was equally frustrating. "Jerry, I respect what you're trying to do," Thompson said, "but moving 15 men and all our gear based on your system, that's a hell of a gamble. What if you're wrong? What if we abandon good trapping ground for nothing?" This was the trap Jerry found himself in repeatedly. His warning system was based on observation and experience, not the kind of concrete evidence other men could easily evaluate. He was asking people to make enormous sacrifices based on his interpretation of sounds and signs that, to them, seemed arbitrary. At the Crow Winter Camp downstream, Jerry found more receptive listeners. Old Bearheart, a respected elder, examined Jerry's wooden markers and nodded gravely. The Crow had their own avalanche warnings, passed down through generations, and they recognized the wisdom in Jerry's hybrid approach. "The mountain speaks to those who listen," Old Bearheart told his people. "This white man has learned to listen." Within hours, the Crow were breaking camp and moving to higher ground on the valley's eastern rim. Their departure should have been a signal to the trappers, but most dismissed it as typical native superstition. By February 13th, Jerry was desperate. His instruments were screaming warnings, the weather patterns were aligning perfectly for disaster, and 43 men were scattered across what he knew would become a killing zone. That evening, he made a decision that would define him for the rest of his life. He began visiting each camp individually, armed with his rifle and the absolute certainty that he was right. At Thompson's camp, he didn't ask or plead, he demanded. "You're moving tonight," Jerry announced, his weapon held casually but visibly. "All of you, up to the eastern ridge where the Crow went." Thompson's men reached for their own weapons, but their leader held up a hand. He'd seen something in Jerry's eyes that gave him pause. This wasn't the ranting of a madman. This was the desperate urgency of someone who knew death was coming. "Give me one reason," Thompson said quietly. "One concrete reason to believe you." Jerry pointed to his bottles and pots, still singing their ominous chorus in the wind. 17 years ago, I was buried alive with 12 other men right here in this country. I learned to read the signs the hard way. Tomorrow, those signs say anyone in this valley dies." Something in Jerry's voice convinced Thompson. Maybe it was the absolute certainty, or maybe it was the visible anguish of a man watching disaster approach. Whatever it was, Thompson gave the order to break camp. The French Canadians were harder to convince. When Jerry arrived at Dubois's camp with his rifle and his ultimatum, the confrontation nearly turned violent. But Old Bearheart arrived just as tensions peaked, adding his voice to Jerry's warnings. The combined pressure of armed persuasion and native prophecy finally broke Dubois' resistance. By dawn on February 14th, 37 men had grudgingly moved to the eastern ridge. 6 trappers from a small independent party ignored all warnings and remained in their camp near the valley floor, convinced that Jerry's system was elaborate nonsense. February 15th dawned clear and cold. From their position on the ridge, the relocated trappers could see their abandoned camps below, looking peaceful and inviting in the morning sun. Some were already grumbling about Jerry's paranoia and discussing when they could safely return to their trap lines. At 10:37 in the morning, the mountain answered their questions. The avalanche began as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across a summer sky. But this thunder grew louder, instead of fading, building to a roar that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. Jerry stood transfixed, watching his worst fears materialize as millions of tons of snow broke loose from the hanging valleys above Bear Creek. The wall of white death swept down the mountainside at speeds approaching 60 miles per hour, devouring everything in its path. Trees that had stood for centuries disappeared in seconds. The peaceful camps below vanished beneath a crushing wave of snow and debris that buried the entire valley floor under depths of 20 to 40 feet. In less than 3 minutes, it was over. The roar faded to an eerie silence, broken only by the settling creaks of compressed snow. 40 men stood alive on the eastern ridge, staring in stunned silence at the transformed landscape below. 6 men lay buried forever, their bodies never to be recovered. Jerry Coulter's strange orchestra of bottles and pots had fallen silent. The mountain had spoken its piece. The silence that followed the avalanche was unlike anything the 40 survivors had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something profound and terrible. 40 men stood on that eastern ridge, staring at a landscape that had been completely rewritten in 3 minutes. Where their camps had been, where they'd eaten breakfast and complained about Jerry Coulter's paranoia just hours before, now lay an ocean of white death stretching from wall to wall of Bear Creek Valley. Pierre Dubois was the first to break. The hard-bitten French-Canadian who dismissed Jerry's warnings as the ravings of a madman sank to his knees in the snow, his weathered face streaming with tears. 22 of his men were alive because he'd finally listened. 6 strangers were dead because they hadn't. The mathematics of survival had never been so brutally clear. "Mon Dieu," Dubois whispered, his voice barely audible. "We would all be down there." Marcus Thompson walked slowly to where Jerry stood, still staring at the transformed valley. The Tennessee mountain man's usual confidence had been replaced by something approaching reverence. He placed a hand on Jerry's shoulder, feeling the tremor of a man who'd just watched his worst nightmare come true. "Jerry," Thompson said quietly, "I owe you my life. We all do." But Jerry wasn't accepting congratulations. His eyes were fixed on the spot where the Independent Party's camp had been, now buried under 40 feet of compressed snow and debris. 6 men who might have lived if he'd been more persuasive, more forceful, more something. The weight of partial success felt heavier than complete failure would have. "I should have made them listen," Jerry said, his voice hollow with guilt. "I should have found a way." This moment, this intersection of gratitude and grief, marked the birth of something unprecedented in the American wilderness. 40 men who'd survived certain death began to understand that they'd witnessed more than just an avalanche. They'd seen the difference between ancient wisdom and modern arrogance, between listening to the land and imposing human will upon it. Old Bearheart approached the group, his weathered face grave but unsurprised. The Crow elder had seen avalanches before, had lost friends and family to the White Death. But he'd also seen something remarkable in Jerry Coulter's fusion of native knowledge and trapper innovation. "The mountain chose you to hear its voice," he told Jerry in careful English. "These men live because you learned to listen. Their children will live because they learned from you." Over the following days, as the survivors established a new camp on safe ground, something extraordinary began to happen. Men who'd mocked Jerry's contraptions just a week earlier were asking detailed questions about how his warning system worked. They wanted to understand the subtle differences in wind patterns that his bottles detected, the way his wooden markers collected snow to reveal dangerous accumulation rates. Thompson was the first to formally ask Jerry to teach him. The request came 3 days after the avalanche, as they sat around a fire built from salvaged wood. Thompson had been studying one of Jerry's hand-drawn maps, trying to understand the symbols and markings that indicated safe routes and danger zones. "I want to learn your system," Thompson said bluntly. "Not just for me, but for my men. We can't go through the mountains blind anymore." The request spread through the group like wildfire. French Canadians who'd initially resisted Jerry's warnings were now begging him to share his knowledge. They'd seen firsthand what ignorance cost, and they were determined never to be that vulnerable again. Jerry's response surprised them all. Instead of claiming proprietary knowledge or demanding payment for his expertise, he opened his methods completely. He spent hours explaining how to read snow conditions, how to interpret wind patterns, how to position early warning devices for maximum effectiveness. He shared not just the technical aspects of his system, but the philosophical foundation that made it work. "The mountain doesn't care about your trapping quota or your profit margins," Jerry told his eager students. "It operates on its own schedule, by its own rules. You can fight it and die, or you can learn to work with it and live." The gift-giving began spontaneously on the 7th day after the avalanche. Dubois approached Jerry with his finest beaver pelt, the kind that would bring top dollar in Street Louis. But instead of offering it for sale, he pressed it into Jerry's hands as a token of gratitude. "For my life," Dubois said simply. "For all our lives." Others followed. Thompson gave Jerry his prized skinning knife, its blade worn smooth by years of use. A young trapper named Samuel Hayes, offered his warm wool coat, the one his mother had made for him before he'd left Ohio. Each gift was more than payment. It was acknowledgement of a debt that couldn't truly be repaid. But the most significant development was the emergence of what the survivors began calling Coulter's Code. It wasn't a formal set of rules, but rather a shared understanding that had evolved from their collective brush with death. The code's principles were simple but revolutionary for men accustomed to the competitive individualism of the fur trade. First, avalanche warnings were never to be ignored, regardless of economic pressure or skepticism. Second, knowledge about mountain safety was to be shared freely, not hoarded for competitive advantage. Third, when someone with proven expertise declared an area dangerous, you moved, no questions asked, no debate allowed. Most remarkably, these principles began spreading beyond the 40 survivors. As they eventually made their way to trading posts and winter camps, they carried Jerry's methods with them. They demonstrated his bottle and rope systems to other trappers, shared his maps, and most importantly, told the story of February 15th in vivid detail. The cultural transformation was visible in how different groups adapted Jerry's methods to their own traditions. The French Canadians integrated his warning systems with their existing knowledge of winter travel, creating hybrid techniques that combined European alpine experience with Jerry's innovations. American trappers began incorporating his route marking methods into their standard practice, turning personal survival skills into community knowledge. The native tribes, who'd always possessed sophisticated avalanche awareness, found new respect among the white trappers. Jerry's validation of traditional knowledge broke down cultural barriers that had previously separated indigenous wisdom from settler practice. Mixed groups began forming, with native experts teaching alongside Jerry's disciples, creating a new mountain culture that transcended racial and national boundaries. By spring, as the survivors prepared to return to civilization, they'd become evangelists for a new way of approaching the wilderness. They weren't just trappers anymore. They were living proof that respecting the mountain's power was not only possible but profitable. None of them had lost their gear to the avalanche, none had lost their lives, and many had learned skills that would serve them for decades to come. The transformation was complete when young Samuel Hayes announced his intention to stay with Jerry through the following winter, to learn everything the older man could teach. Others volunteered to help expand and improve the warning system, turning Jerry's individual innovation into a collaborative effort. As they stood once more on the eastern ridge, preparing to break camp, 40 men looked back at Bear Creek Valley with new eyes. The snow had settled, but the scars remained visible, a permanent reminder of the day they'd learned to listen to the mountain's voice. They were no longer the same men who'd dismissed Jerry Coulter as a madman just weeks before. They were disciples of a new faith, one that worshipped not the mountain itself but the wisdom to hear its warnings. Jerry Coulter's cabin became something unprecedented in the American wilderness, a school, not the kind with slates and primers, but a place where men came to learn the difference between life and death in avalanche country. By 1835, 3 years after the February 15th miracle, Jerry's small log structure near Trapper's Lake had evolved into an unofficial academy of mountain survival. The cabin itself was unremarkable, a typical one-room affair with a stone fireplace and oiled paper windows. But the walls told a different story. Jerry had covered every available surface with his maps, drawings, and charts. Hand-sketched profiles of dangerous slopes hung alongside detailed notes about wind patterns and snow conditions. Pieces of his warning system, bottles, and carved markers served as teaching tools for the steady stream of visitors who made pilgrimages to learn from the man who'd tamed the White Death. Students came from everywhere. Grizzled mountain men who'd spent decades in the peaks arrived humble and eager to learn. Young trappers fresh from the settlements sought Jerry out before making their first forays into avalanche country. Even military expedition leaders, men like John Fremont who were mapping the Western Territories, detoured to consult with the legendary Jerry Coulter. But Jerry's most dedicated students were the survivors of February 15th. Samuel Hayes had kept his promise to stay and learn, becoming Jerry's first formal apprentice. Pierre Dubois returned every winter, bringing new French-Canadian trappers to absorb Jerry's methods. Marcus Thompson established a tradition of sending his most promising men to spend a season with Jerry before they were allowed to lead their own parties. What made Jerry's teaching remarkable wasn't just his technical knowledge, but his ability to blend practical innovation with ancient wisdom. A typical lesson might begin with examining traditional Shoshone snow reading techniques, progress to setting up one of Jerry's bottle warning systems, and conclude with discussions of route planning that incorporated both scientific observation and intuitive understanding of mountain behavior. Jerry had also continued evolving his methods. The crude bottles and tin pots of 1832 had been refined into a sophisticated early warning network. He'd developed different types of sound makers for different altitude zones, created a classification system for avalanche-prone slopes, and established standardized symbols for marking safe routes and dangerous areas. Perhaps most importantly, Jerry had solved the problem that had nearly cost 6 lives in 1832: how to make people listen. His new approach combined fear with education. Every student's training began with a trip to Bear Creek Valley, where Jerry would point out the still visible scars from the Great Avalanche and tell the story of the 6 men who died because they wouldn't heed warnings. "See that twisted pine over there?" Jerry would say, pointing to a gnarled tree that marked the avalanche's furthest reach. 6 men are buried under 40 feet of snow between here and there. Good men, experienced men, dead men, because they thought they knew better than the mountain. The lesson was always the same. Hubris kills, humility saves lives. It was a message that resonated deeply with men who lived constantly on the edge of disaster. As Jerry entered his 60s, his role gradually shifted from active trapper to full-time teacher and counselor. His cabin became a gathering place where knowledge was shared freely, where the competitive secrecy typical of the fur trade gave way to collaborative learning. French Canadians shared alpine techniques with American mountain men. Native elders taught alongside European immigrants. It was a remarkable cultural fusion, all centered on the shared goal of staying alive in avalanche country. The impact extended far beyond individual survival. Jerry's disciples carried his methods throughout the Western Territories, establishing safety protocols that became standard practice for everyone from military expeditions to wagon train guides. His route maps, copied and distributed widely, helped establish the safest passages through avalanche-prone regions that would later become critical transportation corridors. Jerry's peaceful death in 1847 was itself a testament to his methods. He died in his sleep, surrounded by friends and students, having survived 32 years in country that had killed hundreds of other mountain men. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who dedicated his life to preventing violent death in the mountains had achieved the rare privilege of dying naturally in his own bed. But Jerry's story doesn't end with his death. The methods he pioneered, the cultural changes he initiated, and the respect for avalanche dangers he instilled created a direct line of influence that extends to our modern world. Those crude bottles hanging from ropes were the ancestors of today's sophisticated avalanche beacons. His hand-drawn danger maps evolved into the computerized avalanche forecasting systems that protect skiers and mountaineers worldwide. The philosophical foundation Jerry established, the idea that human activity must adapt to natural conditions rather than the reverse, became a cornerstone of modern avalanche safety. Today's avalanche professionals use technology Jerry couldn't have imagined, but they operate on principles he would recognize immediately: observe carefully, respect the mountain's power, and never let economic pressure override safety concerns. Consider this: every time a ski resort closes a slope due to avalanche danger, they're applying Jerry Coulter's core insight. Every time a mountaineering expedition changes routes based on snow conditions, they're following his example. Every time an avalanche forecaster issues a warning that saves lives, they're continuing the work Jerry began, with bottles and tin pots in the wilderness of 1832. The cultural transformation Jerry initiated proved even more durable than his technical innovations. The idea that survival knowledge should be shared freely rather than hoarded competitively became embedded in mountain culture. Modern avalanche education programs, from basic awareness classes to advanced professional certification, operate on Jerry's principle that keeping people alive is more important than maintaining competitive advantages. Perhaps most remarkably, Jerry's integration of indigenous knowledge with European innovation created a template for cultural collaboration that remains relevant today. Modern avalanche research increasingly incorporates traditional knowledge from mountain communities worldwide, recognizing that scientific instruments and ancient wisdom are most effective when combined rather than competitive. The boy who'd crawled out of that snowbank in 1815, traumatized and alone, had become something far greater than he could have imagined. He'd transformed personal survival into collective safety, individual knowledge into community wisdom, and private fear into public protection. Today, when avalanche professionals speak of reading the mountain or listening to what the snow is telling you, they're using language Jerry Coulter would recognize. When they emphasize that no powder day or business deadline is worth dying for, they're echoing his fundamental insight about the relationship between human ambition and natural power. Jerry Coulter's legacy lives on every time someone makes it home safely from avalanche country, every time knowledge prevents tragedy, every time respect for the mountain's power saves human life. In the end, that traumatic morning in 1815 didn't destroy Jerry Coulter. It created him, and through him, it created a tradition of safety that continues to protect us today. The White Death still stalks the mountains, as powerful and unpredictable as ever. But thanks to one man's transformation from victim to guardian, it no longer hunts in silence.